Hello, everyone, and welcome to NC State's Take Back the Night. We are holding a virtual rally. This is a re-recording of our keynote speaker. We're really happy to have you all able to join us digitally, even though we're not able to be in person together. My name is Carlin Wright-Eakes. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Interpersonal Violence Prevention Education Coordinator with NC State's Women's Center. And we're happy to host this year's Take Back the Night virtually. This event is part of our Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We've had virtual events ongoing for the entire month of April. And although we're not able to be in person together, we just want to honor all of our student activists, student survivors, and student peer educators who are constantly working to make our campus a better place. During this recording, if anybody needs to access any type of counseling support, the NC State Counseling Center is open and available to speak with students, and you can reach them at 919-515-2423. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for 2020, Dr. Stephanie Helms Pickett.
Thank you, Carlin. I'm honored to be with you all. Although I miss sharing physical space with you, I hope that we can lean into each other and provide comfort for this challenging moment in time. As shared, my name is Stephanie Helms Pickett, and I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a Black cisgender woman, and I hope to share with you a few of my thoughts centered around surviving. I find it ironic that on a day that the Women's Center and the collective thereof intended to be visible, present and loud with voices and narratives and presence, we find ourselves instead isolated and unable to show our strength, our compassion, our beauty in numbers on our beloved campus. I also have to wonder if it is indeed the universe providing one of her glorious examples of the power that each of us embody within our individual selves and what we each possess to raise attention to gender and sexual violence in our community, and to remind ourselves of the giftings that we each possess as a benefit of what we have survived. What does survival look like? I would suggest contrary to what society has painted it to resemble. Each one of us on this Zoom is a survivor. It may not be related to gender and or sexual violence, but given the current state of our world, yes, you are surviving. You got up. I believe you are reasonably dressed, if only from the top up, competent enough to connect to this experience, and often that is enough. That's a great place to pause, to breathe in, breathe out, because so many people are suggesting that we should be writing books or patents when all that is necessary for you is to maintain and just simply be. As a society, we are reframing and creating space to define a new normal, but perhaps it is in fact what survivors have known all along. So what, pray tell, are the lessons we can learn from survivors, particularly survivors of color, as we navigate being on what the Black Church calls the shut-in list? Allow me to provide a few tangible examples for us to carry with us from the living room to the kitchen, to the restroom, back to the kitchen. Send help now, because especially as I navigate this potato chip ministry that I've birthed. But I'd like to offer as a title, Lessons from Superheroines, AKA Survivors. Growing up as a Black girl on the South Side of Chicago, conversations around my dinner table were rarely shaped by informing me about survival. But these lessons were certainly modeled. My father died when I was 5 years old. My brother was 14. My mother, my first encounter with a superheroine, was widowed at the age of 40, which seemed old then, that is until I hit 40 and now 50. I realized that she was very young. My father was one of the first Black steelworkers in the city. He had a 6th grade education, but like many in his same predicament, he was brilliant. Hailing from the slick streets of Kansas City, he was a veteran, having survived the Korean War and served there, and migrated to the slicker streets of Chicago and met my mom on a blind date. They fell in love, married, and had my brother, And then their lives were incredibly enriched after having me 10 years later. We were in the process of purchasing a home when he was diagnosed with cancer. Suddenly, our entire lives were interrupted, much like that of a survivor in the making. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and suddenly I was enrolled in preschool. I only learned as an adult that my parents desired to spend more time together, knowing the end was inevitable. So while I was excited to play with other kids, that move was strategic. They were taking care of themselves, which is my lesson to be learned from survivors. As a survivor, you have responsibility to yourself first and foremost. It is most imperative that you institute whatever practices that will create space for your healing to begin. And not that superficial societal healing that we are often presented with. Healing from trauma is not instantaneous. It's deep, it's critical, it's messy, and it's strategic. Further, it is evolutionary. And just because you are okay in this moment doesn't mean that you are in the next. And whether other people understand and accept that is not really your concern. However, having enough grace and self-awareness to recognize that in yourself is. My post-preschool ritual was watching cartoons, and eventually it morphed into sitting in the lobby of a hospital. My brother and I were not allowed to go to our father's hospital room for visitation. That practice would be completely rejected today. We were not involved in a transition preparation process. We were not offered counseling or therapy to understand grief. Lesson 2. As a survivor, I would offer that you seek assistance, clinical services to provide clarity, directive measures, into what you are navigating. This is even more important for communities of color and marginalized populations who've been shamed to believe that something is wrong with them from the onset. My family's therapy was centered in the Black church, and while that is still a part of my practice today, I also understand and value trained individuals who are skilled with leading me to unlocking truth and the deployment of tools for my well-being. I love being heralded as a strong Black woman, but not one without acknowledging that my strength hasn't also emerged as a result of favorable conditions. And further, being strong does not mean I don't hurt, and that you shouldn't, in your best efforts, make every attempt to not cause additional harm to me with your actions. After trauma, one must make a remarkably difficult decision to move toward healing. I cannot imagine what that was like for my mother, as many can't understand what it is like for a survivor to return to some sense of normalcy. But what if normalcy is not the key, and instead wholeness is? I credit a sister friend who introduced me to a quote from The Salt Eaters by Toni Cade Bambara, which reads, "Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? Just so's you're sure, sweetheart, and ready to be healed, because wholeness is no trifling matter. A lot of weight when you're well." Lesson number 3. As opposed to searing at survivors and projecting definitions of what their lives should resemble, might we instead curate space for them to demonstrate wholeness in whatever manner they need to live, move, and have their being? I turned to the internet to unpack this concept of wholeness. I found this definition. Wholeness is our capacity to experience health as transcending all limitations while accepting them, overcoming this virus of perfectionism which keeps us locked into an imaginary world rather than the real world. Growing up, the only messages I received about my health were to follow the food pyramid, stay away from crack, and to jump rope for my heart. How time changes. Now, whether on television, online, in print, or driving, we are exposed to limitless messages regarding our health. We live in a society whereby we are encouraged to eat and drink anything we desire, and yet society also expects our bodies to not mimic this behavior. We're too fat, we're too thin, we need to spend more time on our abs, no, our thighs, no, our glutes. Just forget it. We run, walk, and Zumba our new self into existence, and yet sadly, it is still difficult to love ourselves because we are always encouraged to interrogate the reflection in the mirror. The sustainability of wholeness is under duress. Let's return to that scholarly definition we found on the internet, being that wholeness is our capacity to experience health as transcending all limitations while accepting them, overcoming this virus of perfectionism, which keeps us locked into an imaginary world rather than the real world. Lesson 4. If anyone presents to you that you are required to let go entirely of that which comprises who you are, they are, as what my mother would say, lying and the truth ain't in them. Survivors are the sum of all their parts. And the way that we actually fraction, divide, and dismantle folks having to identify as survivors leads me to my 5th lesson, which is a bit more comprehensive, and I'd like to offer it. The superherons know that survivors need for us to, number 1, eradicate our obsession with violence. Number 2, reinstate collective care and responsibility. Number 3, redefine masculinity. And number 4, eliminate the minimalization of the experience and the expertise of marginalized populations. Whew, talk about taking a breath. Lesson 5A from superherons, aka survivors. Society is obsessed with violence. Everywhere we go, there it is. During this home sabbatical, I keep hearing about something called Tiger King. I've not watched it, but the narrative that is perpetuating is that it is about a person who has gotten away with murder. When I have logged into my Netflix account to find something to pass the time, the number 2 shows in the United States trending are Tiger King and Ozark, both of which are inundated with violence. It's not the violence that our Take Back the Night rallies originally advocated against. This is violence associated with people we know, which is critically centered as the violence that occurs on our college campuses. It's not the stranger in the bush, it's the lab partner, someone you dance with at a bar, the Greek life brother, the date at the away formal. And allow me to go a wee bit further. The face of said violence is not only our white sisters, but Black and brown, queer, and male identified. But our obsession with violence welcomes violence into our lived reality all too often. And our numbers will not decrease to the extent that we don't need to associate the term survivor with gender and sexual violence until we own this nasty truth in subsequent consequences. Lesson 5B from survivors. We must reinstate collective care and responsibility. Black and brown people can lead in the manifestation of this truth. My community embodied collective care and responsibility. When one was worthy of celebration, all celebrated. And when one experienced something to spur, mourned, all mourned. We were the next door community app before the prototype was created. No one had business that everyone wasn't a part of. We knew our neighbors, not by our vehicles, but by their voices and narratives, traditions, rituals, and realities. We believed in community policing, and a uniform was not required. We watched, we studied behavior, we prepared, we stuck together. Sadly, I don't witness this practice on our college campuses as I would desire. Prior to coming to work at NC State, I served for 5 years as the director of the Women's Center at Duke University. The women's soccer team reported fewer incidents of violence as compared to any other group or organization. They engaged in safety planning as if they were preparing for the MCAT. There was a determination of where they were going to party. They discussed the host, the opportunities, the risk involved. Some were designated as sober. A pact was made to arrive and depart collectively. No one was allowed to YOLO without everyone's consent, and agreement. And no one was ever left alone. This isn't to suggest that violence was never perpetrated against these individuals, but harm was certainly reduced because they engaged in collective care and responsibility, much like Black and brown people's historical underpinnings, much like when one finds in the community of survivors. Lesson 5C from survivors, redefining masculinity. I do not identify as male. I do not desire to cross or come across as speaking on that by which I have no lived experience. But since we just spoke about collective care and responsibility, I feel like I have a few thoughts. I have a spouse who is male. I have a bonus son. I have a brother, all of which, of course, makes me an expert. But in all seriousness, we cannot afford to not offer space for men to embody what wholeness resembles for them. In what ways are they allowed to weep, like I've been doing since we've been mandated to stay indoors and watch as people get sick and don't heal in the ways that we've hoped for? In what ways are men allowed to change their mind without being called anything other than a man? In what ways are men allowed to define their own persona, not dressing in what society has told them, not loving who society has told them, not being who society has told them? In what ways are men encouraged to be joyful and playful and human? In what ways have we added them to the narrative of survivor of violence? And when men embody or enact any of the aforementioned statements, how do we respond? With ridicule, with disgust, with shame? Redefining masculinity requires support and advocacy in the same ways and manner that we expect to be offered to survivors. Lesson 5D from superheroines, aka survivors, our elimination of the minimalization of the experience and expertise of marginalized populations. This is the one that made me say, whew. I shared that I served as the director of the Women's Center for 5 years. I was at the time about a 19 or 20-year higher education administrator with an advanced degree, and I identify as a survivor. I hired a clinician with 15 years of experience and who identifies as a survivor with a master's degree in social work. I hired another person who'd worked previously at a women's institution at a neighboring institution in sexual and gender violence prevention with a master's degree. The three of us, or the trifecta, which I affectionately called us, were Black and female. Though magical as we consistently battled a difficult reality whenever we attempted to sprinkle our pixie dust. We shared neither race nor gender in common with what society has deemed as the standard. We were intent on reducing harm and the perpetration of violence in the community. We created programs, initiatives, even a campaign based on data, best practices, and exemplars in the field of social psychology. Yet our collective knowledge and expertise were constantly challenged, often by white men and white women who were my children's age, not yet with their first degree, who were our collective, or compared to our collective seven. To be honest, I understood young minds enthusiastic to enact social change and their pushback to us. Well, sometimes I did. But what caused me more pause was experiencing that same resistance from colleagues and other administrators who failed to value our expertise, our knowledge, our practice. Folk that had no experience or very limited experience with gender and sexual violence. If I were to highlight something I desire for you to tuck in your toolbox after we depart, it would be this. Listen to the voices and narratives and lived experience of marginalized populations. Let me say it again for the people in the back. Listen to the voices and narratives and lived experiences of marginalized populations. There is value in a people whose DNA is steeped in survival. It's been said that if we carry intergenerational trauma, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom, which is of value in understanding survivorship. Simply said, believe Black women, believe brown women, believe marginalized populations in the same way that we admonish to believe survivors, period. Believe that they can carry survival at their core. Believe that they matter. Believe that they are riddled with fact, truth, brilliance, and antidote to our ills. Wholeness is no trifling matter. And when we emerge from our cocoons, we must make a determination, a recommitment, if you will, to once again honor survival and those who are survivors. The reasoning that undergirds the flapping of the survivor's cape is worthy of introspection. May we listen intently to them, to what works best for them, to what they need to be their best selves. May we do so without judgment or a projection of what we believe, contrary to what they either say verbally or the truth telling in their eyes. May we be slow to speak and quick to hear. May we examine our organizational practices and rituals that do not lend themselves to the welcoming and affirmation of everyone and anyone. May we be bold to unpack the unfortunate connection between alcohol and violence. May we recommit to investigating our personal practices that are steeped in violence. May we inspect our personal decision-making that does not honor those in society who have been the recipients of the most harm. Certainly now, we are all vying for toilet paper, but may we not forget those who are historically and even contemporarily left with the scraps, and yet are still able to construct something joyful. I implore every person watching this video to spend some time considering how you've contributed to the affirmation of all survivors and how you've contributed adversely to their justification. Let's spend some intentionality in thinking about how we can create more safety beyond that simply suggested as a violent virus. May we use this sheltered time to consider the role and impact of fear, how it stifles us, how it keeps us under subjection, how it's real. May we consider that the emotions some of us are experiencing for the first time are actually lived experiences that some of us cannot escape and will not necessarily change when people are allowed to gather in companies of more than 10. When we are allowed to return to our activities, our campuses, consider to what extent survivors are able to return daily. Consider if all survivors are represented in that representation. And if not, how you might use your agency to create for them safety, security, assurance, and assuredness to be whole. So I have a participatory request. If you are able, place your hands on your hips. If you choose, you may stand. Breathe in, breathe out. Experience the fullness of your greatness. Allow your cape to soar. Remind yourself that you are confident, you are necessary, you are human, you are a superheroine because you are a survivor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing your lived experience and your wisdom with us for this evening. We'd like to close out with a reminder of a few resources available on campus. The NC State Women's Center has survivor advocates who are available to work with students remotely. You can reach them by emailing ncsuadvocate@ncsu.edu or calling the 24-hour sexual assault helpline at 919-515-4444. You can also access help available 24/7 at Interact in Raleigh, and you can reach them by calling 919-828-7740. Thank you for joining us for the Sexual Assault Awareness Month presentation of Take Back the Night. And as Stephanie closed, remember to practice as much deep breathing in this moment as you are able. And please stay connected with us through the Women's Center. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and again, reach us on the helpline or any of the emails listed. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you again to Dr. Helms Pickett.